So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the last speaker of today's events, the last keynote speech. As mentioned, I have a great satisfaction to introduce my dear colleague, Professor Gillian Verschleus, Professor of Classical and Mediterranean Archaeology at the University of Leiden. Professor Verschleus's research focuses on empire, cultural encounters, and globalization, in particular through the exploration of the dynamic processes at work in the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. Not only does the Eurasian context figure prominently in his work, but also do the local, regional, and global perspectives. He's certainly known for the innovative use of methodological departures emanating from social and exact sciences in his historical approach. Among his many valuable contributions, I would like to mention his excellent book, Aegyptica Romana, which was published in 2002 with Brill, and which represents the Roman views of the Nile, and his most recent monograph, Visual Styles and Constructing Identity in the Hellenistic World, Nemrut Draj and Comagene under Antiochus I, published in 2017 with Cambridge University Press, which is now required read for the study of the Persian and Hellenistic kingdom of the Commagene. This work is now further enriched by a recently co-edited volume, together with Michael Blömer, Stefan Riedel, and Engelbert Winter, called Common Dwelling Place of the Gods. I got it right. Commagene in the local, regional, and global Hellenistic context, which is published with Steiner Verlag as part of the series Oriens et Occidens in 2021. Also noteworthy is the co-edited volume, together with Rolf Strutman, here present as well, Persianism in Antiquity, which treats the reception of all things Achaemenid in the world of antiquity, which is a fantastic volume. And only because the two of us also contributed. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Verschleus for a talk entitled Containing Connectivity, Empires, Globalization in the Axial Age. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rahim, for this generous introduction. And thank you for inviting me here. That's in fact very brave, because I'm not a specialist in the Achaemenid world at all. So I prepared myself very well, but I'm also here to learn, let's say, from all your expertise. And what I therefore try to do is to zoom out a little bit and actually tell the story that Professor Rollinger already told you, but from a rather different perspective. So my talk is called Containing Connectivity, Empires and Globalization in the Axial Age. And let me start with the remark that empire remains something, you could say, of a contested concept. Because the moment that you evoke the word empire, whatever empire it is, a lot of intellectual baggage comes with us, and that had to do with the fact, of course, with the fact that empires are so long-lived. So the Roman Empire immediately evokes these kinds of images. It has something to do with Europe, but not always in the way we want. And a few years ago, we had a Dutch prime minister who, when there was another wave in the refugee crisis, said, mind your borders, because if you do not mind your borders, you will end like the Roman Empire. And there was, of course, a lot of debate about that. So empires are part of us in a very distinct way, you could say. And there is a kind of development over there, so I did my Robert Rollinger reading as much as possible in preparation of this meeting. Empires are about power and imperialism, but I think the most important thing that changed is that we have seen in the last 20 years or so that that's not a top-down process, but also a bottom-up process. And there already the idea of networks and globalization that I will slowly work towards comes in. And I found it, I think, very well summarized in this quote from an article by Claudia Glatz from 2009, when she says, as a collection of bi- and multilateral relationships, empire is always in the making and therefore subject to continuous modification. So conventional anachronistic views of empire, using maximum spatial extent, chronological epochs of political power, and the entirety of material remnants of the central polity and peripheral regions as evidence for imperial minds, what we did in the old days, let's say, they mask crucial processes of re-establishment, regonization, and redefinition of dominance relationships. And that's, of course, the bottom-up perspective that we all follow now in one way or another. But what still remains, you could say, is that imperial transformations are held responsible for change. Imperial transformations are driving change. And this is actually also the great presentation that we just had, follows that same paradigm. You have imperial transformations, and therefore things in society change, and material cultures change, and so on and so forth. This is how we often still write ancient history. It's a history of empires, and empires drive change. Now, as a kind of thought experiment, and thought experiments are dangerous, as you see over there. This is also a thought experiment by a little toddler. I would like in this lecture to do something else. And I was triggered by a quote by Walter Scheidel. You should not always believe Walter Scheidel, but sometimes we should, because he says important things. He said here on empires, it's unnecessary and unhelpful to examine claims and ideologies associated with imperialism and exploitation. And this is, of course, what the written sources give us when what we are interested in, when we are interested in ultimate causation. So what I would like to do with you in this 30 minutes, I would like to think towards what could be a form of ultimate causation, you could say. And therefore I would like to turn the question on its head, and I would like to explore with you the idea, if it's possible, that imperial transformations are not driving change, but are the result or are the outcome of change. Then your question, of course, immediately is, what is then change? What is the most important factor driving change in this first millennium BC? And there's a clear answer, I think, because that is increasing connectivity. The main driver for change in our period is that we have more and more connectivity and a network that becomes ever bigger and ever more intense. And I think this is also what Robert has shown in his overview. So then we suddenly are confronted with a very different type of question. So might the main evolutionary function of empires be the containment, you could say, of increasing connectivity? So are empires in fact instruments that emerged on the stage of world history to contain and make sense of globalization processes? Because why we only see empires or so prominently in this first millennium BC? Well, this is something I would like to explore with you. But even if we do not arrive at answers to these, what I think are really important questions, I think it is still very interesting to have this connectivity perspective, because through it, trying to understand empires as a way of dealing with globalization, we actually become more sensible, you could say, to a whole kind of different subjects or foci or sensibilities that do not have to do with the usual aspects of empire studies that are power and imperialism. So I would also like to explore with you some of these perspectives that are added by looking at empires from this perspective. And what is very remarkable there, and what struck me, and what actually instigated me to prepare the talk in the way that I did, is that the period chosen for this conference is exactly the period, 800 BC, 200 BC, that Karl Jaspers famously defined as the Axial Age, the Achsenzeit. I will come back to Jaspers and his, what I still think are very important ideas, in the second part of my talk. So the three new aspects that I will deal with and that I will illustrate are that I think thinking in terms of connectivity moves us from cultures to cultural interaction and from identity to identification. And also that comes together in the concept of network power that I will later define for you. I will also talk a little bit about borders, not about borders in the way that we usually do, but borders from the perspective of connectivity are also very interesting because they present the other as action orientation. And I will also talk a little bit about canonization, a process that we mainly see in the second part of our period as a form of innovation. Now, first this main point of departure. So the main driver of change for our period is increasing connectivity. Many people nowadays more and more think that connectivity, increasing connectivity, globalization, however you want to call this, is actually driving world history from its very beginnings. As you all know, we all in one way or another come out of Africa, so you can see the evolution of humankind as a form of globalization from day one. William McNeill is a great proponent of this view, and in the book from a while ago already, The Global Condition, he says the career of these webs of communication and interaction, those constitute the overarching structure of human history. So for McNeill and for many other world historians, history actually is world history, is globalization from day one onwards. And it's not necessary for you to read it, but this is just to show that he talks about the contemporary period, modern period, Middle Ages, and then antiquity. He talks about the metropolitan web. So it's the first World Wide Web, metropolitan web, old world web, cosmopolitan web, and then the electrified cosmopolitan web. So the McNeils were sure that something was going on in terms of globalization in antiquity as well, and I fully agree with them. It took a long time for scholars to really realize that. In the old days, globalization, that's really literature from the 90s, was associated with the 20th century alone. But already soon people realized that globalization also has a kind of deep history from itself. And the discussion went back very quickly from the 20th century to 1492, when the Americas were when the Americas became part of the global network again, actually, we have to say. And then there was a very important discussion that people realized that the networks of those periods we also saw before. And that meant that the world does not need to be literally global to talk about globalization. And that opened, of course, Pandora's box, because then the old world trade routes are a form of globalization. You have your Afro-Eurasian perspective. But also the rise of Islam might be a form of globalization. And I think many of us, and I've worked on that myself intensively, now really agree on the fact that it's impossible to really understand Rome if you do not have this global perspective. So where in the old days all maps of Rome were, of course, as you know from your school books, the Mare Nostrum with some regions around, Rome was unthinkable without all these arrows to the Sahara, to India, to Parthia, to Bactria and China, to Asia, and so on and so forth. So this, of course, implies a different definition from globalization than most of us were used to work with. So globalization is now seen as the process by which the world increasingly becomes seen as one place, and that's very important, the ways in which we are made conscious of that process. Very important is that globalization, although it has global in the name, is about the global and the local simultaneously. The global is made up by all the local in the same way as local things are determined by global developments. So it's a kind of entanglement between the two. There's an interesting book, Globalization and the Ancient World, that has defined these 8 hallmarks of globalization, which can serve as a kind of checklist what goes on. And Justin Jennings is very useful, I think, because he sees globalization as this process that is evolving throughout world history, but in some periods there's much more connectivity than in other periods. And those are the periods that he proposes to call globalization. So you see these kind of upsurges, when there is suddenly a kind of explosion of connectivity, an increase in connectivity, and then we better talk about globalization. So the terms are related. I think connectivity is the most general and descriptive term. Network gives a methodology to map and therefore to better understand connectivity. And globalization for me is very much about the impact of connectivity. So the ways in which we are made conscious of that process. And I think that is crucial to understand the period that is central to our conference. So let us then, and I can do this very briefly because Professor Rollinger already showed you an overview of the first millennium BC, think a little bit through this very special period in the deep history of globalization. So once again, there's always connectivity, and in many periods there is increasing connectivity, but for me, actually the defining characteristic of the first millennium BC is that there is an explosion of connectivity, and therefore that should be central to our interpretation of that period. So it is a rather specific punctuation. This starts already earlier, the late Bronze Age. We talk about this multi-centered Western core encompassing the Mediterranean basin, Egypt and Western Asia, and this collapsed around 1200 BC. There is a recent book by Eric Klein who called it the year that civilization collapsed, but what I found very interesting is that already Klein, without discussing seriously any globalization theory, already talks about empires and globalized peoples, apparently as a framework to understand what goes on in this period. Now we know very well that centralized palace economies, they made way for more volatile seaborne trading practices, and that was a process that was accompanied, we now know very well from archaeological research, by a surge of innovation in maritime technology. And that's very interesting because there is globalization and deglobalization. Those things always go hand in hand. But it's interesting to look at the network, and the network has always strength, a frequency, a directionality and a content. So where on the one hand the network became less connected in terms of those elites talking to one another, you could say that in terms of maritime technology and trade there was an acceleration. So we always have to look at different aspects of the process. And this then is the idea of this system as it develops in this first millennium BC, with very important those nomadic peripheries, borderlands, however we should call them, buffer zones, playing a very important role. So it's really a kind of next stage, you could say. In these first periods, objects play a very important role also to document the network. And what's happening from 800 BC in particular, and this can be very relevant, is that we now have people very intensively joining the network as well. We talk about Phoenician colonization and Greek colonization, and we know that it was not colonization in our sense of the word. We also know that it was not Greek. So both Greek and colonization you have to put between inverted commas. We now also know that the Phoenicians were earlier than the Greeks, but you can imagine that in terms of feeling the impact of connectivity, these things matter a lot, because the network is strengthened. And the network is strengthened again, of course, by the Achaemenid Empire that you see over here, and very fundamental again in terms of the cognitive impact of connectivity, because that's what I am most interested in. This is the real breakthrough. And Professor Rollinger finished his talk by saying the Persian Empire is fundamental to understand the story of empires. He's absolutely right, I think, but the Persian Empire is absolutely fundamental to understand what connectivity does in this first millennium BC. And because I started as a classicist, it took me a while to understand that, but the Persian Empire is key to everything that happens later in the Hellenistic world. And we can say a lot about the impact of connectivity in this period. Because it is around this period that for the first time we have imaginations of the world as a global whole. So if you read Herodotus, he talks about the world as one world for the first time. So his view was global. We now know that it was not really global, of course. But the point is that for his idea, it was global. And there is another remarkable testimony. This is a 19th century picture by Alma Tadema of the philosopher Diogenes of Sinope, who was asked around 400 BC probably, where do you come from? And then the philosopher answered, I am a cosmopolites. This is remarkable. Somebody in 400 BC who says, I'm a citizen of the world. Of course, he mentioned something different with it than we would do today. But it means that the conception of the world as one world was clearly there. So this is the real breakthrough. And the fact that the Achaemenids call themselves universal has a lot to do with that, of course. Now, Alexander the Great, it also took me a very long time to realize that, adds nothing, you're absolutely right, to the Achaemenic model. He only strengthens it once again, you could say, by drawing in, because he comes from the borderlands, I fully agree, he more intensely draws in the Mediterranean in this whole picture, and therefore we need to know so much more about the Seleucid Empire, because they are, in that respect, the real heirs to the Achaemenids. And then this is the outcome in 200 BC, the period we stop. And I brought you two quotes to summarize this explosion that I, of course, only very briefly described. We have Nicholas Purcell, who says, meanwhile, with the continuum of the ancient world, the play of intensification of production, mobility and exchange can increasingly, during the Hellenistic period, because he's a classicist, he didn't know about the Persian Empire, otherwise he would have started with the Persian period, be seen in a crescendo, which produced in the early Roman Empire a paroxysm of integration, whose nature is still a subject of debate, but whose quite exceptional scale by pre-modern standards becomes steadily clearer. And even more pronounced, I think, Ian Morris, who says by 200 BCE, the East and West had more in common than at any time since the Ice Age. Each was dominated by a single great empire with tens of millions of subjects. Each had a literate, sophisticated elite schooled in axial thought, I will come back to that, living in great cities fed by highly productive farmers and supplied by elaborate trade networks. And in each core, social development was 50% higher than it had been in 1000 BC. So this explosion of the first millennium BC, an explosion of globalization and its impact, also resulted in a lot of innovation, you could say. It also resulted in a lot of managing and in a lot of problems, because societies, of course, have to adapt to these new circumstances. So while also in our periods, a lot of problems are actually problems of being connected, being problems of part of a bigger network, just think of COVID and trying to make sense of that, I think similar processes were going on in this first millennium BC. Now, why is Jaspers so important? I think, and that's a bold statement, that Jaspers was actually also realizing these kinds of things that were going on. He only tried to explain them in different terms than I do to you now, but therefore his ideas remain very crucial and have for me been great stimulus. Jaspers wrote this very famous book, Osmond der Geschichte. It was sold in millions of copies in Germany at the beginning of the 50s, because actually he was dealing with the traumas of the Second World War, and he wanted to go back to the foundations of the European civilization that had disappointed him so much, you could say. So the meaning of the book actually was different, but it also has in the first 50 pages a kind of development of world history. And then Jaspers used an idea that somebody, an Iranist called Anquetil du Perron, already realized much earlier. Anquetil du Perron, you see here, he has a book on the Avesta, and Anquetil du Perron was the first to realize that around the middle of the first millennium BC, at different places of the Afro-Eurasian world, thinkers emerged that would determine history, well, for the very long array, actually until this period. And this idea, the Entdeckung der Gleichzeitigkeit, as you call it so beautifully in German, was taken up by many thinkers in the 18th and 19th century. And this is something that Jan Assmann, in his book Achsenzeit, Ideologies, die Moderne, has beautifully shown. But only Karl Jaspers used it as a kind of overarching idea to talk about world history. So many of the world's most influential thinkers, Confucius, Buddha, the Jewish prophets, and Socrates, they all emerged around the middle of this first millennium BC. And Jaspers said the classics, so those early works of philosophy, literature, and theology that would be the guiding principles for every race and societies, they were all created at that very time. And that is indeed, if you think about it, remarkable. So in his words, in diesem Zeitalter wurden die Grundkategorien hervorgebracht, in denen wir bis heute denken. Und es wurden die Ansätze der Weltreligion geschaffen, aus denen die Menschen bis heute leben. In diesem Sinne wurde der Schritt ins Universale getan. And of course, das Universale, and this is the reason why I took this quote, that resonates strongly with the fact that it is exactly around this period that this idea of the universal empire of the Achaemenids that emerges. Now, we can have a whole conference about the Axial Age, and there have been many Axial Age conferences. It's not necessary to redo it. People understood it as a historical theory, and it's really not that. So the chronology is not correct. You have actual societies before the Axial Age, for instance. So it is not really one age. And I think that all culminated in this very important book, The Axial Age and its Consequences, in which people do not talk about a specific actual period of actual characteristics anymore, but they talk about actual breakthroughs. And that can be very useful for our purposes. So Hans Joas, an important German sociologist who's one of the editors of this book, he said that the Axial Age debate is one of the most important developments in the area of comparative historical social sciences, and an instrument to write what he calls a contingent history of emergence. And I think that's actually also what Robert and myself both presented in our overviews. So what are actual breakthroughs? Well, those are periods characterized by a high degree of what they call reflexivity, historicity, and what is called agentiality. Now, reflexivity is the human ability to step outside the present and to imagine different worlds. And this is, of course, actually, if you think about it, very, very crucial for all kinds of intellectual innovations. And historicity, that refers to the translation of that imagination in time, by which the present can be separated from the past, but also, very importantly, separation between self and other. And agentiality, ugly word, it means that human action based on those two, on reflexivity and historicity, is intended to change the present and to determine the future. So you use the past to determine the future, and we already saw some examples in the previous lecture. And when I read this, I asked myself the question, because this is what empires are very good at. Imperial imagination and those projects you were finalizing with, Robert, that's all about historicity, reflexivity, and make that work to determine the future agentiality. So are empires some sort of consolidation, you could ask yourself, of these kinds of actual breakthroughs? And once again, then the agency is not, and that's of course my point, with the empires doing things, but with the empires trying to make sense of the increasing connectivity they are confronted with. Now, let me briefly give you some examples. Some examples of how things look differently from the perspective that I've just been sketching, and how that can help us maybe to rethink some of the issues we are struggling with in empire studies. So, when we try to think about relation between imperial transformation and increasing connectivity in the way I have just summarized, and the first example I want to briefly discuss with you on the basis of this fantastic book, I think, by Henry Colburn, Archaeology of Empire in Achaemenid Egypt, is the oasis of Karga that you see here. So what happens to the Karga oasis in Egypt when it comes under Persian rule? Now, his recent analysis demonstrates that the Achaemenid Empire had a profound impact on the landscapes and societies of the oasis, but not in the way we usually imagine imperialism to work. Many things in Karga were transformed by the introduction of novel agricultural economies, and those were the qanat structures and irrigation technology that were coming from Iran. Now, this resulted in unprecedented levels of agricultural production, the successful introduction of new crops like olives and castor beans, and population growth. Now, the enduring success of this new agricultural economy way into the Hellenistic period was possible because the oasis was better connected than ever before. So, through its inclusion in the Achaemenid Empire, it became connected with a larger network, also in a literal sense, for instance, through the Persian road system, and the fact that the lingua franca, Aramaic, had now come into being to facilitate trade communication. I think Colburn rightly talks, therefore, about the many unintended consequences of the globalizing strategies of the Persians. This was not what the Persians imagined or what they had in mind with their imperialism. It was an unintended consequence that has something to do with how the network behaved, you could say, and worked out. Now, another example of this is the use of Greek silver coins as a novelty to the oasis. They didn't have it before in its economy, and a testimony to the role it now plays in larger networks of trade. So the Persians, we know, actively made use of many local strategies native to the region for a long time already, like the building of temples, with the intention to link the oasis to the Nile Valley. So, in terms of the intensification of production, mobility and exchange, Achaemenid imperialism here in Karga was all about new connections and the possibilities the connections provided in the first place. Now, another example along the same lines is Gordion. And here I base my analysis on the essay by Elsbeth Duzenberg that you see quoted over here. Now, we know, she analyzes very well, that the network of the Achaemenid Empire provided Gordion with levels of intensification and innovation comparable to those of the Karga oasis initially, because of the development of the sheep and goat husbandry that it enabled. Now, the long-term impact of that network that was so positive in Karga was very different over here. And this is due to the fact that through the conquest of Alexander the Great, the strength, the frequency, the content and the directionality of the ties that held the Persian network together changed. Because through Alexander's conquest, as you know, the Persian road infrastructure in Asia Minor collapsed, and for Gordion this had many, again, unintended consequences. As a result, for instance, imports from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Iran and Afghanistan ceased completely. And even the very popular Greek-style vessels that we know from Gordion, and you see here, they were no longer important but had to be locally produced. So overall we see a demise in population and a less intensive use of the surrounding landscape in Hellenistic Gordion when compared to the Persian period. So she estimates that sheep and goat husbandry might have declined 60 or 70%. And this must of course have played a role with the demise of administrative practices and the political military significance of the site that was then furthermore affected by the arrival of the Galatians around 260 BC. So it seems therefore that the network first granted a lot to Gordion, but after that the network took miserably from Gordion what it had generously granted earlier. So most important here is actually the network itself. The power of the network and what a network enables you to do. Not so much the power and imperialism of those in charge. My second example to think with you through the relation between imperial transformation and increasing connectivity are borders. But also there, I think that taking aboard this globalization perspective can be very fruitful. because most of the time we see borders as something that fences off, you could say. Because borders are, if you think about it, extremely important to make sense of the world. So if you draw a line, if you draw a border, it's actually one of the most important things to do because it defines an identity. Through a border you have self and other, and you have inside and outside, you could say. But the results creates difference, but difference that's actually much more than a barrier. And that is when you create something else, or something outside, or the other, at the same time that becomes something for you to innovate on. And this is, I think, if you think the immense amount of peoples and cultures and traditions that the Persians were confronted with through their empire, or later the Seleucids through the empire, this actually gave them a lot of raw material, you could say, to work with and to innovate on. And this is what, in an interesting field now that you call possibility studies, is very well realized. I give you a quote here from a social psychologist, Vlad, who summarizes very well when he says, difference is the ontological root of the possible, as there would be no sense of possibility in an undifferentiated universe. And once again, my message here, of course, is that through this increasing globalization, in the first millennium BC, the universe becomes time and again much more differentiated. And in particular, he says the differentiation between self and other opens up multiple ways of seeing things and of being in the world. So there is more and more other in this first millennium BC, but the other as a kind of action orientation. Well, and what I mean with action orientation, I can illustrate very well by the opening of a famous book that some of you might know, the Principia de Scienza Nuova by Giambattista Vico, which is a kind of new novel way of thinking about what history is. And Vico, he begins his world history with the giants. He says, so the giants, they were living on Earth, and the Earth at that time was totally covered by trees. So the giants, actually they did not know where they were living, but they thought they knew where they were living because they were just dwelling under the trees. And suddenly one day there was a lightning, and the lightning did stroke something in the trees. A lupus, he calls it, which also means eye. And then the giants looked up and they saw the heavens, they saw a sky, and therefore they realized that this was the earth. So through the creation of, they suddenly realized that the trees actually was a border and that there was something outside. And because of a confrontation with the other, it's only then that you can define yourself, and only then they realized that there was a bigger world outside and they had to define their own place in it. And Vico then describes how they start cutting the trees, and from the trees they make houses, and from the houses grow villages, and from the villages come cities. So the discovery of the other in this way by the giants, for Vico, is the beginning of world history. Only a confrontation with the other set things in motion. And once again, my message here would be, there is a hell of a lot of other in the first millennium BC, more than ever before. And that is the action orientation that I'm talking about. And that's the importance of borders. My third example, and then I slowly come towards my conclusion, because I've taken this keynote very seriously, as I hope you see, but I'm also aware of the fact that there's only one thing between you and the drinks, and that's me. I will think about that perspective as well. So canonization, because that's an important subject in relation to what I have been discussing as well. So what I have been arguing is that there is more connectivity, so there is more network power, so there is more other, and therefore there's more action, there's more innovation. Think of Vico. And let me underline, those are processes with a lot of friction and asymmetric power relations. When we talk about connectivity, it's not that we want to have these out. But when there is more other, and I already commented on that, there is also more than ever before the need to define your own place within a more global space. And this is what all globalization theory is telling you. So the moment your world becomes bigger, you need to define better your own place as part of that world. If you're not confronted with the other, there is no need to define what you are or what your place is. It's only confrontation with a bigger space which forces you to define your own place. And that seems to be happening exactly around this period in 500 BC in particular. So Herodotus, it's one big intellectual project of defining what is Greek in this global world. And therefore Siep Stuurman, in a very important book, he calls it the invention of humanity. He says this is the moment that humanity actually is created, because people see that they are actually all one species. But what you are going then to do is, of course, define the differences between these species in relation to one another. And this is very interesting because this takes us back to this reflexivity, historicity and agentiality that was given to us by the Axial Age debate. So the fact that you step outside the immediate present and imagine different worlds. This is what Herodotus is doing. And that you then separate self from other and think about the past, and that you also use that, and this is not so much what Herodotus is doing, but what of course empires are doing, to determine your own future. Because that's important. The moment that you are confronted with more options, you could say, than ever before, you have to pick and choose what your past will be, you could say. So to act for this agentiality, specific choices have to be made. So which past and which other, you could say. And this brings us to canonization, because canonization is exactly about that. It's about interacting with the past in an attempt to shape the present and thus to determine the future. And this is crucial to all these empires that we have been discussing, because they all come from somewhere, of course, and therefore they have to relate to where they come from. So establishing a canon is one of the most important acts in defining a cultural identity through identification. And the famous words by Jan Assmann, Kanon ist die Mémoire volontaire einer Gesellschaft. So what they choose to remember and what therefore becomes their foundation. So in my globalization terms, I would say, so what from the network that created us, we tell ourselves and others really matters. All cultural projects are created by these networks that we have been describing, but if you want to act, you have to choose from the network what really matters. Those are anchors, and those anchors are crucial for societies to function. This is why Persepolis is created in the way it is created, and this is why the Ptolemies also say that they are Egyptian pharaohs. Those are anchors, identity anchors, which helps societies to function. And what is very interesting and very resonates again strongly with what Robert says, the more global the world becomes, the more they seem to need it, the more legitimation is necessary. And this is your stage 2, I think. So unknowingly we have very well calibrated our talk. As a conclusion, so once again, this was a thought experiment, and many of you might actually felt that I'm not here, but that I've fallen down a long way. But what I wanted to explore with you is the idea that imperial transformations are not the ancient themselves, as they are always portrayed by showing maps of empires and then talking about the developments in society. It might be the other way around. So they might be the outcome of increasing connectivity. So what about the relation? I think this is my general question. What about the relation between globalization and empires? And my conclusion for now, but maybe it will be different Friday, I think that relation matters. I think that's clear, and that it also needs much more attention. And I think I also argue that to better understand the imperial transformations in the ancient Near East during this period, it is useful to revisit ideas on the Achsenzeit. Because I have the feeling that Jaspers and all those other people, that they were intuitively trying to make sense of what we also try to make sense of here in Obo. And I hope that my 3 examples illustrated, at least a little bit, how useful this can be. If we think in terms of network power, I think it is very easy to move from cultures and identity that never make sense towards cultural interaction and identification. These are, I think, key words to understand our periods. I think borders are very important, but borders in a very different way. Borders, the more borders you have, the more other there is, the more it allows you to do. So the fundamental breakthrough of 500 BC, of the Axial Age, the invention of humanity, is the fact that people suddenly realize that everybody is the same and therefore everybody is also different, and that has to be explained. This is maybe where anthropology, this is also what Stuurman says, starts. And the third thing is canonization creates anchors for innovation. And I think a lot of the imperial transformations are actually geared towards this. So for me, our period, to finalize, is about embedding global diversity. So this is their main challenge. Of course, there are also challenges in terms of warfare and in terms of economy and in terms of all those other things that we talk about all the time. That's, you could say, the hardware. I'm very interested in that as well, but we have kind of good picture. This is the scaling up. The story of our period is a story of scaling up. But then, if that's really true, we also should be interested in the cognitive impact of that scaling up. And I think a lot of the cultural products we are interested in actually have a lot to do with that cognitive impact of globalization, of scaling up. And what is, and that's a thought I leave you with, what is very interesting, and that if we take this very radically, this might be one of the successes of these empires that emerged from 200 BC onwards. If you only talk about the Roman Empire, that I know best of the 4, Romans are obsessed with their past. There is nothing that we can really define as Roman, because everything Roman is or Etruscan or Greek or... So there is an enormous mnemische energie, you could say. So the Romans learned the lesson of embedding global diversity extremely well. And that might be one of their evolutionary successes. Thank you.